Hi there, everybody, and here we are again in the 1920s. This is going to be the second of the three recordings that we have about this particular topic. And so, once again, I hope you're all doing really well. Let me know whenever you've got questions about anything so that I can help out. And when we talked yesterday, well, not yesterday, which whenever you listen to it, I guess, when we talked before about the 1920s, gave kind of the broad strokes about what was going on in terms of lots of tension between different groups of American society, whether it was age-based, right, kind of a generation gap between old and young, whether it was growing kinds of changes in gender roles and gender expectations during the 1920s, whether it was the question of urban versus rural populations and the way that they perceived the world around them. Lots of different things going on. And so that's kind of the overarching theme about the decade that we're going to be using as kind of framing our presentation of the topic. The last section, we focused primarily on politics, and what we see at the time is very much a Republican domination, politically speaking, especially at the national level and especially in the White House, partially because Republicans are presenting the American voter with very popular candidates who are, for the most part, not very dynamic, not very ambitious or assertive kinds of candidates. And this is going to be in direct contrast with people like Theodore Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, some of the really titanic figures really in all of presidential history. And they both happened to be in the first 20 years of the 20th century. So the voting public is in the mood for something a little more mellow, I guess you could say, politically speaking. And so we talked about some of the scandals that struck Harding. We talked about Hoover's election in 1928 being kind of a bellwether in some ways for what's going on nationally. His opponent, Al Smith, exists in a very different political world. He is a machine politician. He's open about it. And he is a Catholic, which is going to cause a number of stresses and tensions in the voters' minds in America, because there is still a very pretty significant anti-Catholic bias among Americans at the time. And so this is a good kind of indicator of some of those tensions and stresses that we'll talk about in more detail in terms of immigration policy, in terms of the question of tradition versus modernity, those kinds of things, right? And so that's going to be the focus of what we're going to do in this particular section. So we'll start out with some racial and ethnic concerns, I guess you could say, during the 1920s. One of the things that distinguishes the decade historically is a resurgence in the KKK, right, the Ku Klux Klan. And we tend to imagine the Klan most active in the years following the Civil War, right, the 1860s, 70s, 80s. And then, of course, we definitely recognize the Klan's primary role in resisting and undermining, I guess those are almost euphemistic, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. But in actual fact, the Klan's greatest membership, and probably its most visible period in American life, is the 1920s. And they are very active, very open about their activities. In 1923, the peak of their membership claims, they claim membership of 5 million, right, which is a pretty substantial number. In the 1870s and 80s, and then also in the 1950s and 60s, it's nowhere near that. There are certain parts of the country, especially the Midwest, where Klan membership is almost a badge of honor, and in some cases, it's almost a requirement for people who want to serve in public offices. At one point, it was said that if you wanted to be the mayor of Akron, Ohio, you had to be a member of the Klan, because that was one of the unspoken expectations that voters had. And that was a place like Akron, right? So it's not confined to southern states where we sometimes think, oh, well, the kinds of people that advocate the policies and viewpoints of the Klan, they tend to be from southern states. That's not the case, right? This is something that is widespread in the country, especially in the 1920s, and especially in areas like the Midwest, partially as a result of what's known as the Great Migration. The Great Migration is a really almost 30 to 40 year period when African Americans are moving out of southern states and into northern and northeastern states in the search for jobs, in the search for more opportunities for voting freedoms, more opportunities for legal protections and that kind of thing. The Midwest during the 1920s has also been on the receiving end of pretty dramatic population changes because of immigration. So lots of immigrants coming into the country end up moving through places like New York or Boston or Philadelphia and end up in places like Cleveland or Detroit or Chicago or Milwaukee. And so this is going to change the demographics, to change the ethnic makeup of a lot of places. And this ends up, I guess in no uncertain terms, scaring lots of whites in the Midwest who feel that their traditional sort of primacy, socially and politically, is going to be undermined. It's very similar to the same kinds of psychological, emotional responses that have contributed to recent elections from basically 2014 to the present. Lots of the sort of conversation, even though it's not explicit, a lot of the conversation in American politics today goes right back to that question of white men traditionally held the reins of power and the levers of power, and as the nation's population is changing, as the representation in government is changing, there's a lot of fear about that. And so it's still happening today. It is still bearing, fruit. It's still causing repercussions in the country now. In the 1920s, the idea here was, well, we have this idea of when America was something different, when America was something better, and we want to restore that, right? We want to get back to that time. Basically what they mean is we want to get back to that time when white men were the ones in charge, and other people, women, young people, non-whites, right, fill in the blank, knew their place and weren't trying to disrupt the system. So this is one of the great advantages of history, is being able to see how these cycles kind of repeat over and over and over again, and being able to understand that what's happening in the country today is a similar kind of circumstance to what happened in the past. In the 1920s, the Klan ends up kind of shooting itself in the foot. There are lots of really, really serious scandals that strike Klan leadership. There's a lot of factionalism over leadership and policy agendas and that kind of thing. So that by 1930, it's gone from a claimed membership of 5 million all the way down to about 9,000. So this is going to be by far the heyday of Klan activity and Klan membership, but it doesn't last very long, certainly. So we've talked about also the question of immigration, the question of how do immigrant populations integrate into American society, and how do Americans view the existence and the arrival of immigrant groups. Again, another thing that you're probably aware is right at the center of a lot of the political conversation in the country today. In 1924, Congress passes a law that severely restricts immigration into the United States. And this is actually going to be the way immigration policy is set up all the way into the 1960s. So it's going to be generations, decades before this law is revised and adjusted. So the law of 1924 says, and this is going to be kind of complicated, it says we're going to look at the census of 1890. And when you fill out the census, it asks you all kinds of different questions about your occupation, your income, where you live, political affiliation, your parents, all kinds of different things. Part of the census asks you your ethnicity, right? Your ethnic background. And so what the Immigration Act of 1924 was going to do was going to say, we're going to look at those results from the 1890 census and where people said that they were sort of ethnically connected to. And we're going to say that new immigration from any country in the world is going to be limited to 2% of the number of people in the country in 1890 that claimed ethnicity to that country. And that's why I say it's really hard to explain easily. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the 1890 census might say that there are 1 million people in the United States who say, yes, my ancestors are English, right? I claim that my ethnicity is English. So the law says, all right, from now on, every year, since 1 million people in the country in 1890 say that they have English blood, every year from 1924 on, we will allow 20,000 people into the United States coming from England, right? Because 20,000, as near as I can figure, is 2% of 1 million. So it sounds fairly straightforward, but if you're looking at this with a critical eye, you're recognizing that the 1890 census is almost 35 years old at this point, right? Because the country takes a census every how often? Every 10 years, which means that the most recent census in 1924 would have been 1920. So why wouldn't you use the 1920 census, right? It seems like it would give you the most accurate representation of the country's population. It seems like it would be easier to sort of explain, well, we have this many people in the most recent count of our country, this many people claiming these different ethnicities, so that's what we're going to base it on. But the purpose of this law was to limit the number of people coming into the country from Asia, Africa, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe. And the reason you pick the 1890 census is because that was the last census to take place before the massive influx of immigrants into the country, especially from places like Southern and Eastern Europe. It was also a census that happened after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so it means that if you're looking at the number of people in the country that claim these different ethnic backgrounds, it's going to be very low. But if you're looking at the number of people in the country that claim quote-unquote acceptable ethnic backgrounds, like English or French or German or Scandinavian or Scottish or Irish, it's going to be higher. And so what you're doing is you are deliberately manipulating who can come into the country based on a very particular interpretation of the country's past. And so what comes of this is represented in this map that was from the New York Times in 1924. There's a couple things here that I think are a little bit misrepresented. For instance, it shows France as being a country where only 1,000 to 5,000 people a year can come into the United States. I think that's a misrepresentation. I think that was a mistake in the creation of the map originally, because there were way more people with French ancestry in the United States than that would indicate. But you can see, right? England, Scotland, Ireland, over 50,000 people a year would be allowed to come into the country from those parts of the world, because there were already a lot of people in the country from there to begin with in 1890. And so they would have a way higher percentage of, or a way higher quota as a result of that 2% number. By the flip side, places in Eastern Europe, right? Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Greece, below 1,000 people a year can come in from those places. By the same token, Russia, Italy, Czechoslovakia, no more than 1,000 people a year can come into the United States from those countries. So this is deliberately designed by Congress to take a very particular snapshot, a not representative snapshot of the country in 1924, a 35-year-old snapshot of the country by that point, and say, this is going to define the way we will allow people into the country going forward. And like I said, this is the law that will be in place all the way into the 1960s. And the 1960s law is largely the way that the system operates today, with some fairly glaring exceptions here and there that have been implemented really in the last 3 or 4 years. So one area where we see a lot of this tension then is in the question of immigration, the question of race relations, the question of changing population figures in the country and how the country decides to react to that, right? There is also a very significant tension that exists between urban populations and rural populations. And this gets reflected in many ways in a broader kind of debate over modernism, science, technology, that kind of thing, versus traditional values, especially values of fundamentalist religion. So people that live in the countryside typically view the urban population as being pretty much young, so different in terms of their socioeconomic standing, different in terms of their demographic, but also very materialistic, very, in some cases, amoral or immoral. And so there is this growing kind of sense, again, something that we can see in the country today too, this growing kind of sense that there are parts of the country that are simply not on the same page as other parts of the country. And so lots of Americans say, you know what, I'm going to sort of bunker myself into religion as a way to hold off those impulses, hold off that pressure of a new, different kind of way of life. It can be sort of wrapped up in a very basic cliche that what is old and traditional and familiar is good. What is new and different and progressive is scary. And so a lot of people in the country say, you know, not I'm going to try to convert other people into my faith so much as I'm going to use my faith as this dike, this kind of wall, this dam to hold out the pressures of the outside world. The flip side is the urban intellectuals that look at the rural populations and they say, well, you know, those people are all bumpkins, they're backwards, they're regressive, they are trying to back up the flow of progress, they are trying to undermine the advancement of human intellect and human achievement. And so it gets to be a very rancorous, very contentious and bitter kind of debate in a lot of ways. And it's something that people today would refer to as culture wars. right? Once again, you can see echoes and examples of this very same kind of situation in the country today. Not necessarily strictly separated by urban and rural, although that's a part of it. Not exclusively separated by generation, right? Older and younger, although that is a part of it too. But there very much is this ongoing kind of sense that the past existed in a particular way that needs to be celebrated, and change is a problem that kind of threatens either the memory of that past or the value of that past in sort of defining the present. And so lots of stuff going on today that we can look back at the 1920s in particular and say, same kind of stuff was going on, right? So really interesting kinds of things going on there. A good example of a particular moment in the 1920s when a lot of these different tensions are kind of revealed is what's known as the Scopes trial. And the Scopes trial happens in the summer of 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, little town in sort of south central Tennessee. And the literal focus of the trial is over whether or not a high school teacher in the Dayton school system had taught evolution in his class. But what the trial then really becomes really quickly is a matter of what should be the source of knowledge, what should be the source of sort of the understanding of the universe, and what should be the source of America's emphasis intellectually going forward. Should it be a faith-based understanding of the world, excuse me, or should it be an understanding of the world that's based on science and technology and progress? So, excuse me, basically what happens is different states in the United States in the 1920s had begun passing laws in various ways banning the teaching of evolution or other non-biblical explanations of biology or physics or that kind of thing. And Tennessee was one of them. The American Civil Liberties Union says we want to challenge that law. We want to challenge it wherever we can, whether it's in Tennessee or Kansas or Kentucky or wherever was passing these laws. The city leaders of Dayton, Tennessee say, you know what, this could be a real windfall for our town because people might want to come to Dayton, Tennessee to watch this trial when it happens. So why don't we see if there's somebody in our school system who will kind of volunteer to be the guinea pig of this. And that person ends up being John Scopes. And Scopes is, like in a lot of small towns, he teaches a number of different subjects. He's also the high school basketball coach. And he says, you know what, I'm single, I'm not married, I'm right out of college, basically. I don't have intentions necessarily of staying in Dayton, Tennessee my whole life, so I don't have many bridges to burn. I'll go ahead and be the subject for this case. And it becomes a media sensation, right? As the city fathers, kind of city leaders, I guess, kind of hoped it would be, but it actually gets out of even their control. And so it ends up bringing in people who sort of gawk at the proceedings. It brings in hundreds and hundreds of reporters, newspaper reporters, radio reporters, sort of social commentators, that kind of thing. It also draws the attention of two of the most famous people in the country at the time, William Jennings Bryan, who had been a major political figure in the 1890s and 1900s. And into the 19-teens. By the 1920s, he had sort of moved himself into the realm of being a very, very popular and in-demand religious speaker. And Clarence Darrow, who volunteers his services for the defense, who at the time was by far the most famous defense attorney in America, probably still is the most famous single defense attorney in American history. So even the legal team on each side is based on celebrity. Scopes is found guilty, but I mean, there was no doubt about it. There was no question of his guilt, but that wasn't really the purpose of the trial. In its essence, the trial was designed, and Darrow intentionally positioned his case to be this, to be a question of whether or not religious fundamentalism was a sound basis for educational philosophy and educational content, right? The question of, is science or religion the appropriate understanding to be teaching students as far as the nature of the natural world? And it helps to reflect these same tensions of urban versus rural, modern versus traditional, science versus religion. It really exists in this kind of center point, this kind of nexus point of a lot of those different questions that are swirling around America at the time. And the picture on the right is one from Dayton, Tennessee, where a particular organization, the Anti-Evolution League, sort of sets up a roadside stand selling books and pamphlets and encouraging people to support the cause of biblical education in schools. The drawing on the left is from a newspaper at the time that takes the opposite perspective, that says Bryan, who is portrayed there with his bag and his sort of sack suit and floppy hat, everybody at the time would recognize, even if it weren't for the WJB initials on his bag, everybody would recognize that that's meant to reflect William Jennings Bryan. Takes the position that the purpose of the trial is actually more about stifling freedom of thought, stifling scientific investigation, setting the American educational system back by emphasizing non-scientific kinds of explanations for the natural world. So they both have very different perspectives in what's happening and why, and what the consequences or what the long-term impact of this decision is going to be for a lot of people. One of the other areas of social tension that we see at the time is prohibition. Prohibition really gets going in the 1920s. It lasts into Roosevelt's first term. Roosevelt ends up pushing for the destruction of prohibition, the repeal of the Prohibition Amendment. Basically, there are a number of different threads that are coming together here. One of them is during the First World War, a lot of Americans are concerned that German Americans aren't American enough, and lots of German Americans had started their own breweries in the country. So part of Prohibition was an attempt to limit German Americans' economic influence in the country. Part of it was trying to sort of undermine German Americans' economic independence. Part of it was a social reform effort that says, if you look at lots of criminal behavior, whether it was domestic violence or burglaries or vandalism or petty theft or that kind of thing, you can supposedly trace it back to alcohol. And if we can ban alcohol, we will stop all of this crime, because the only thing causing people to engage in these criminal behaviors was alcohol. Well, the temperance forces, the social reform forces managed to get prohibition passed. It goes into effect in 1920. And immediately, there is a dramatic surge in organized crime. People are making fortunes off of running illegal liquor from point to point in the country, selling it in speakeasies. Really, it ends up not being enforced very well. It's easy to bypass. The money involved in violating prohibition means that lots of public servants are bribed, whether it's judges or politicians or police officers or police chiefs or sheriffs. Pretty much anybody, with a very few exceptions, was going to be targeted for this kind of bribery and extortion, and in some cases outright violence. So it ends up not achieving any of the results expected by the reformers that really wanted to push it, except for, in some cases, destroying a number of breweries and distilleries that never managed to recover. So that goal was of course, achieved. In 1933, Prohibition is repealed, partially because people finally recognize that this is a lost cause. Partially it was repealed because reopening brewing and distilling was seen as maybe a way to spur at least a certain amount of economic recovery at some of the worst times of the Depression. And also it was seen as a way for the government to raise much needed tax revenue, because alcohol is definitely one of the areas that the government taxes in some respects maybe more heavily than other things. And so with the government in need of paying for more and larger social programs and work programs and that kind of thing, there was the realization that this might be a way to raise some of that money. So it's, again, another example of some of these ethnic tensions. It's an example of some of these generational tensions, young versus old. Lots of different things going on where the country was really at odds with each other in a lot of different ways. So that's where we're going to pause here. Our next section, the final section when we get to it, we'll be talking about some of the movements that exist, the New Woman, the New Negro, some of the literary and consumer culture that comes out during the 1920s. In some cases, again, still things that we can see popping up in classes in America today, still things that we can see having consequences and ripple effects all the way down to the present. So I hope everyone's doing really well. Let me know if you've got questions about any of that stuff, and I will see you the next time we have one of these sessions.